My first goal was to express the complexities of modern life, and I got on to the idea that the way to express complexity was through space. I was interested in complex spaces, multiple spaces, paradoxical spaces, and then I got on to the idea of four-dimensional geometry as the architecture to house all these complex spaces. It was after I got interested in four-dimensional geometry that I became interested in the theory of relativity. And coming to the theory of relativity after first learning the four-dimensional geometry gave me a different point of view about physics. I kept trying to visualize everything, visualize the four-dimensional field that they talk about analytically.
A line is one-dimensional. A square is two-dimensional. A cube is a three-dimensional square. But what is a four-dimensional cube? In fact, what is the fourth dimension?
The fourth dimension has been a subject of speculation for centuries. When Einstein developed his relativity theories in the early 1900s, four-dimensional geometry became part of our modern vocabulary. What is just now coming to light is the fact that four-dimensional geometry was also a major influence on early 20th century artists. Cubists, futurists, suprematists, and constructivists. The inspiration for breaking down traditional perspectives and reinventing space to make it as complex as the modern world comes in large part from their speculations about the fourth dimension. Mathematicians and physicists deal with the fourth dimension in formulas, but can you learn to see it? My work is based on the proposition that you can learn to see it and experience it as real.
In his studio in New York, Tony Robbin is creating his new painting, Fourfield, a large work based on new techniques for visualizing space as a four-dimensional experience.
We almost always experience our everyday world as three-dimensional, but that is our subjective experience, the way our mind pictures the world, and in most cases, it works. But if you look at how physicists and mathematicians describe our world, it is nothing at all like the space we walk around in. In fact, the objective world, as they would describe it, is four-dimensional. For years, I've been fascinated with the possibility of visualizing the properties of four-dimensional space, of adding the power of graphic insight to the mathematicians' algebraic descriptions. As far back as the early 1800s, mathematicians were developing a geometry of four dimensions. But by the beginning of the 20th century, mathematicians were drawing pictures of four-dimensional objects. Here is one of them, the four-dimensional cube, the hypercube. Just what are we looking at here? We can get an idea of what this is all about by looking at the shadows of three-dimensional objects like this cube. Since childhood, we've learned to interpret the shadows of three-dimensional objects, and we can see these three-dimensional objects from their shadows alone. Even without seeing the cube itself, we know from its flat shadows what it looks like in three-dimensional space. When I rotate this cube, watch what happens to the shadow. See how elastic these shapes are? The sides of a cube surface squeeze together, sometimes hiding whole planes behind lines. In fact, the argument can be made that whenever we see a three-dimensional object, a person, a table, a chair, we are actually seeing their shadows, their projections on the two-dimensional surface of our eyes. This process is automatic. We are completely unaware of it. Surely this process is part biological, but I believe it is in great part cultural. My point is that if culture can teach us to see a three-dimensional object from its two-dimensional shadows, it can help us to see a four-dimensional object, a hypercube, from its projections in three-dimensional space. The computer is a powerful tool for visualizing these concepts. These remarkable scenes from a film by Thomas Banchoff and Charles Strauss were made using a computer program that allows you to manipulate the hypercube in real time. The computer actually displays the shadows, the projections of the hypercube. That is to say, it shows us what the hypercube looks like projected onto a three-dimensional space and rotated through the fourth dimension, much the same way as we created the two-dimensional shadows of our three-dimensional cube. I believe that the three-dimensional worldview that we use to structure our experience is not adequate to encompass the experiences that we have in modern life. There is so much information now that can't be fitted into a traditional three-dimensional structure. Since the three-dimensional worldview doesn't completely work for the objective world, and since it doesn't completely work for the subjective world either, we ought to abandon it. Can we really do this? Can we really rid ourselves of 500 years of spatial conditioning and see space not as a three-dimensional, but as a four-dimensional entity?
The development of perspective in the Renaissance allowed artists to collapse three-dimensional forms into two-dimensional images on their canvases. Perspective is not magic. It's a set of rules, a system that projects three dimensions into two, much the same way as Tony Robbin fits four dimensions into three. Critic Carter Radcliffe said of Robbin, "He invites us to bring a new way of seeing into focus peculiar to our time and place. Robbin evokes the structure of our vision, not its contents."
Artists respond to a crisis in culture with a new style. I think the crisis today is a feeling that there is no way we can get a handle on our experience. We do not have even the hope that human consciousness can ever encompass modern life, much less enjoy it. There's too much chaos, too much confusion, too much discontinuity, too much complexity. We don't have the mental software, we don't have the mental systems to cope. But I think that if you had four-dimensional geometry as your working model of the world instead of three-dimensional geometry, that you would have the conceptual power to deal with this complexity and to find it pleasurable. In my work, I'm trying to lead the viewer into a real experience of four-dimensional space. It takes a while to learn to see it. As you walk along looking at Fourfield, concentrate on one small section of the painting, one of the elements. Observe the changing relationships between the wire rods and painted lines, how the shapes unfold against each other. What I've done here is to use two-dimensional and three-dimensional elements together to fabricate the visual information necessary to see four-dimensional space, what I call the Fourfield. I'm essentially an artist, and the efforts most meaningful to me are those which lead to a greater aesthetic awareness of my experience. The fourth dimension has provided me with a way to get a handle on the complexities of modern life.
As his work unfolds, Tony Robbin is continuing the process of reimagining space, of working on the